I thought I'd try something a little bit different today. I thought I'd try something a little bit fun, a little bit off the beaten path. I wanted to talk about 5 albums from big bands, mainly prog bands, I think they're all prog bands, that came out with stellar records in their late stages of their careers. You know, these are albums that came from bands that in some ways kind of reached their peak and put out their best work back in the 70s, and then came back 20 years later with one of their best works ever. Because I find that a lot of bands that have, 30 to 40, 50 or 60 years behind their belts, they just kind of stagnate. They just kind of tread water a little bit, and each new release is fine, but you don't get like a new classic. You don't get like that big instant oomph. So we are looking at 5 records that came out after their big release. And I wanted to, put a little bit of time between the big releases of the 70s and then some of the releases later on. A couple of these, I tried to do it like within a 20-year gap, so enough time had passed between their big hit and then the next item. But I did kind of play with the rules a little bit in that case. So there's one album in particular that came out, I think, just shy of 20 years. But yeah, so enough preamble. Let's dive into it. And let's first talk about Pink Floyd. Obviously, Pink Floyd was one of the biggest bands of the 70s. They put out one of the biggest albums of all time with Dark Side of the Moon. But then in the 80s, they started to waver a little bit. I think after The Wall with the final cut and then the dissolution of the Roger Waters-led Pink Floyd and the rebirth of the David Gilmour kind of led Pink Floyd within A Momentary Lapse of Reason, it was shaky at best. I have a fondness of Momentary Lapse of Reason, but I know not a lot of people do. That cannot be said about the album that we're talking about here, which is The Division Bell by Pink Floyd. Came out in 1993, I believe. So it is kind of, 20 years between 1973 and 1993. Only just, only just. I think Division Bell is one of the band's best albums. It's one of my top 5 Pink Floyd albums of all time. It really, took all the ideas and all the foundational materials that they used for Momentary Lapse of Reason and then created something even better. And I think this is like the perfect iteration of the 3-piece Pink Floyd band with Nick Mason, Richard Wright, and David Gilmour. The 3 of them working in tandem in a perfect trinity of players. One of the best records, I think, from the 90s, especially when a lot of other prog bands were trying to put out records in the 90s and having varied success. I'm looking at you there, Rush. Pink Floyd, Division Bell, a great late stage album. Speaking of Rush, let's talk about Rush. Their last record of Clockwork Angels. Absolutely one of the best. The only actual concept record from the band. Yeah, getting their big heights in the 70s, reinventing themselves and reaching even greater heights in the 80s, there was this kind of prolonged lull that they had once they got to the late 80s and early 90s with albums like Counterparts, Roll the Bones, and Test for Echoes. People were kind of disappointed with some of their outputs. Then they came back with Vapor Trails and Snakes and Arrows, and I love both of those records. I actually have a very fondness for Snakes and Arrows. I think it's one of their best works, and it doesn't get the appreciation and love that it really deserves. But I think the album that sorely gets looked over because it's their last one is Clockwork Angels. From start to finish, it's one of the best records that they've ever put out and one of the most solid records from start to finish. There really isn't a low point on this record, which I couldn't say for Vapor Trails or Snakes and Arrows. This one flows perfectly. It follows a brilliant and beautiful storyline. It's very steampunk in that sense that I absolutely love. And it has banger after banger after banger. And the final track of this album, the final track of any Rush album with The Garden, so freaking good, so immediate, and so meaty. So, gotta talk about that one. Let's talk about another band. This was another final album, and a lot of these are the final albums, and that is with King Crimson and their album of Power to Believe. Now, I think the 3 albums they put out post the Andrew Below, 3 of a Perfect Pair, Beat, and Discipline, those albums were fine. They're fine. But really, it was Construction of Light, Thrack, and Power to Believe that I have a very soft spot. And I think Power to Believe is the best iteration. And I'm seeing a trend here. I'm seeing a trend where these bands will come back and they're going to try to reinvent themselves, try to recapture some of that momentum that they had in the earlier decades. Take a couple albums and then just knock it out of the park with the final iteration. And that's what we have with Power to Believe. It starts off with the unofficial final track of the Lark Song and Aspect Suites with Power 5, or I think it's Level 5, and it captures that same chaoticness, that same groove, that same power. And I love the fact that they basically, like Robert Fripp saw some of the big metal bands of the time, like Tool, and was like, let's do that. And they did on Power to Believe. And this entire album, once again, from start to finish, is banger after banger after banger. Some of the most intricate and intense works. I feel as if they took what they were trying to do in the 80s, but blended it with some of the more jazzy, impressionistic, and improvising stuff that they had with, Lark Song and Aspect and Starless and Bible Black, and put it onto this album. So if you haven't listened to Power to Believe, you gotta listen to it. It is such a great album, one of the best King Crimson albums. I think that these albums, like the last 3 records of their discography, get overlooked, and unduly so. Some of the best work that King Crimson has ever done. Okay, let's go to another prog master. Let's talk about Yes. And Yes is a weird one because unlike all the albums that I have talked to so far, which like this was the last record that they have put out, Yes has put out other albums after this one, and I would say put out great albums after this one. But I wanted to really showcase this one because it's one of my favorites. Again, I don't think it gets the love and appreciation that it really deserves, and that is Magnification. So this one comes in a sweet spot for me because a couple years prior to this, you had The Ladder, which was one of the best Yes records that we had gotten up to that point. We had just got the 3-punch of Union, Talk, and Open Your Eyes. Talk is the only one that's listenable of those 3. They were really wavering. They came out with The Ladder that came out with some of the best Yes music that we had had since the big heyday of the 70s. And then they improved it even further with Magnification. And part of the charm of Magnification is they played with a full orchestra, and that really suits Yes's music perfectly. It provides that symphony of the symphonic rock that Yes was playing with. And it's one of the best Yes albums. And then they followed it up with Fly From Here, which was kind of taking a lot of the demos and a lot of the rough drafts of the playing styles from Drama and reinventing it and kind of recontextualizing it in a, 2010s landscape. And to this day, those 3 records of The Ladder, Magnification, and Fly From Here, one of my favorite 3 album runs of Yes. And Magnification, right smack dab in the middle, it's my favorite of the 3, and it's the one that I continuously come back to. So if you haven't listened to Magnification, please do so. It is just a fantastic time. And unfortunately, since Fly From Here and Return Flight, both of which are fantastic, I love them both in equal measures, they started to put out some duds. Heaven and Earth and, The Quest. Both of them were a little bit on the stinker. Mirror to the Sky is the only one that's kind of listenable. All right, the final one that I want to talk about, and that is from Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull. This could have easily been a Jethro Tull album, but at this time in Ian Anderson's, career, he was putting out a lot of his solo work. So he had just put out Thick as a Brick Part 2, which is fine. It's a little bit of a pale comparison to his original, but he put out Homo Eroticus, and in my mind, this is one of the best Ian Anderson or Jethro Tull albums kind of ever, and I feel like this one kind of got lost along the wayside. Like, for those that know about this album and listen to this album, they love this record, but I feel, once again, that's kind of lost to the wayside. And it has all the staple sounds and song structures that I love of a good Jethro Tull track. There's lots of flutes, there's lots of rock to it, there's a lot of energy to it. The poetry, the lyrics are just on point, very similar to how Ian Anderson, is punchy and is quick like that. And then after this, there was a little bit of a hiatus, and then they came back with the Zealot Gene and Rock Flute. And they're fine, but those are under the Jethro Tull monikers. So I actually prefer Homo Eroticus to either of those albums, and I prefer Homo Eroticus to anything from Jethro Tull, I think, since A. You know, I think everything after A for me was just kind of fine. Like Beast and Broadsword and Crest of a Knave are fine. But I would listen to Homo Eroticus before I listen to those guys. So those are my 5 late stage albums from big prog groups. Those are my lists. What are yours? Let me know about those down below. Let me know about your experience with those albums that I mentioned also by commenting down below. And that's what I've got for you guys today. That's what I've got. So I hope you guys are doing well. I hope you guys are having a great time. I hope fall is ramping up for you guys as well. I'm not a big fan of summer, but I friggin' love fall. So now that the weather is starting to change a little bit, get a little bit cooler, I am just so very happy. So enjoy yourselves, take care of yourselves, and have fun. And that's where I'm going to leave you. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.